Pramati Digital Class 10. I am Justin. In today's episode, I am going to take up the interesting topic that is footprints without feet from the supplementary reader. This story has been divided into two parts. In today's episode, I am going to take up the first part of the story. Before we take up the story, let me give an introduction to the story. This is an abridged version or shortened version of An Invisible Man, written by H. G. Wells. Dear students, Footprints Without Feet is a scientific fiction and imaginary science story. Griffin, a scientist, discovers a rare drug which enables him to become invisible like a sheet of transparent glass. He was a genius but a lawless, eccentric, irritable person. He sets fire to his landlord's house, steals money, and misuses his scientific invention for his selfish motives. So, here, the story is a sort of indirect warning to scientists how their discoveries can be misused or abused. So, they discovered atomic energy for the good of mankind. The same, however, is threatening the very existence of mankind. So, the students, first paragraph. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh, muddy imprints, that is, impressions, of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? As they gazed or stared, a remarkable, means noticeable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Further, footprints followed, one after another, descending, means coming down the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed, fascinated, attracted, until the muddy impressions became fainter, dim, and fainter, and at last disappeared altogether. So, yeah, two boys followed footprints without feet. Two boys had seen the muddy footprints of this invisible scientist descending the steps of a house in the middle of London. Where? In the middle of London. Could they be able to see? But they could not see his feet. So, yeah, there were fresh footmarks of a barefooted man. The boys followed them. The impressions got fainter and finally disappeared. So, I have highlighted meaning of difficult words, so you can make a note of it. So, we move on to the next slide. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. The bewildered, stunned, or highly surprised boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. So, yeah, Griffin, a brilliant but a lawless scientist. What do you mean by a lawless scientist? One who doesn't abide by the rules and regulations. So, a brilliant but a lawless scientist. So, he had discovered a rare drug. By swallowing it, he became what? Transparent and solid like a sheet of glass. To become invisible, he had to take off all his clothes. So, yeah, the mystery of footprints was quite simple. The boys were following a scientist. He had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. So, we'll move on to the next slide. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless, not obeying law person. His landlord disliked him and tried to drive out, eject him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he became a homeless wanderer, without clothes, without money, and quite invisible, until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. So, wandered in London streets. Who wandered in London streets? Invisible man. So, Griffin wandered in London streets. He wandered how? Moneyless, homeless, and cold as it was winter, and he had to take off his clothes to become invisible. He didn't want anybody to notice him. So, he took off his clothes to become invisible. So, he became a homeless wanderer without clothes. He left footmarks as he walked. Come on, let's move on to the next slide. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London, but his adventures were by no means over. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. It was midwinter, the air was bitterly cold, and he could not do without clothes. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. So, yeah, Griffin is in London store. Where is he? He's in London store. Felt hungry and cold, so he entered a big London store at closing hours. So they were about to close the shop. So the air was bitterly cold. He was naked. Griffin was naked. Instead of walking about the streets, what did he do? He entered a London store for warmth because the air was bitterly cold. It was midwinter. He could not bear the cold atmosphere, the cold weather outside. So he entered a London store for warmth, to keep himself warm. Come on, let's move on to the next slide. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed, means having wide boundary hat, became a fully dressed and visible person. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts, that is, warm canvas. So, yeah, we can find he helped himself. Griffin is in London store. He helped himself with warm clothes and food. Went to sleep on a pile of quilts. So he enjoyed the pleasure of clothes and food freely. So he became fully dressed up with shoes, an overcoat and a hat. How was the hat? Wide brimmed hat. And we can also find he slept on a pile of quilts. So he had cold meat and coffee too. Even he had sweets and wine from the grocery store. Finally, we can find that he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts. Come on, let's move on to the next slide. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked, got frightened, and began to run. They naturally gave chase. You can find the picture that shopkeepers, they are chasing the invisible man, Griffin. So you can find here, he didn't wake up until the assistants arrived next morning. So when they came near, he panicked and began to run. So we can also find that the shop assistant saw him because he could not wake up before the store opened. So what did they do? When they saw a couple of them approaching, the shopkeeper, they started chasing him. So he got panicked, got frightened, and he began to run. So the assistants were shocked to find this man inside the shop, and they started to catch him. But Griffin, he tried to escape because they naturally chased him to catch hold of him. Come on, let's move on further. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So, once more he found himself invisible, but naked in the chill January air. This time he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company in the hope of finding not only clothes but also something that would hide the empty space above his shoulders. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of the theatre world. So, yeah, he could escape only by running and taking off his clothes to become what? Invisible. Next, what happened? Then he went to Drury Lane, the center of the theatre world. He could become invisible only if he was totally naked. So he took off his newly found clothes. Once more, he became naked in the chill January air. So in second para we find he hurried to Drury Lane, which is in the center of the theatre world. Double shop. He made his way invisible upstairs and came out a little later wearing bandages round his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, hairs on cheeks, and a large hat. To escape without being seen, he carelessly, cruelly attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. So, Griffin, entering a theatrical store, he wore a long coat, bandages to cover his face and neck, a wide brimmed hat, false whiskers, and nose and dark glasses. He became fully visible. So he robbed the owner of the theatrical company. So what we find here? To escape without being seen, he carelessly attacked the shopkeeper from behind. Not only attacked, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find with him. So he found the shop he was searching finally. So he came out of the shop wearing all these things like bandages, dark glasses. Then, when the shopkeeper noticed him, he attacked the shopkeeper and robbed him of all the money he could find. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Iping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. The arrival of a stranger at an inn in winter was, in any case, an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging, made all people talking. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly, but Griffin had no desire to talk, and told her, "My reason for coming to Iping is a desire for solitude, loneliness. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face." So, yeah, Griffin, he heads towards Iping, a lonely village far from London crowd. So he wanted to get away from the crowded London. He came to the village called Iping. What did he do there? He booked 2 rooms in a local inn. So after his arrival at Iping, he rented 2 rooms in the inn. So his strange appearance and unusual time of arriving made people suspicious. But he told Mrs. Hall that he had met with an accident and he wants rest. He wanted to take rest and be left in solitude, alone, loneliness. So he didn't want anybody to disturb him. He wanted loneliness, solitude. Inspired that our guest was an eccentric, means freaky scientist, and in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. But the stolen money did not last long, and presently Griffin had to admit that he had no more ready cash. He pretended, however, that he was expecting a check to arrive at any moment. So, here Mrs. Hall she observed what eccentric nature of Griffin. So here he kept his room locked. He used to become furious, angry if anyone opened it. Mrs. Hall did not mind his eccentric nature, as he had made her the payment in advance. So she too was in need of money. So she didn't mind the eccentric nature of scientist because he had made her the payment in advance. So the students, before we wind up the first part of the story, I just let us recall what we studied in this first part. Here, the story begins with the two boys following muddy footprints that are being formed without any feet or person being visible. So these are made by whom? Griffin, who is an eccentric scientist. He has managed to make a drug which on consumption or drinking makes a person what? Visible or invisible? Invisible. The lawless person that he is. He was a lawless person, an outlaw, one who doesn't abide by the rule or law. Then he burns down his landlord's house and escapes after having the invisibility drug. He takes off his clothes to be completely invisible. However, being the middle of the winters, the cold and hunger drives him into a store where he uses the clothes and eats the food for free. He gets caught in the morning because he got up late, then goes to a theater costume shop from where he picks up some bandages to form his head and some clothes so as to appear like a visible man. So, the students, we shall continue the second part in the next episode. If you have any doubt in this first part, you can make a note of it and you can clarify it during our online class or during our regular class. Thank you for watching.